right, 2 o'clock. We're back in session. Please join us for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We all do that so well. We must be practicing that pretty often. We just have a quick report out of the closed session.
There is no reportable action out of closed session.
Thank you. We'll move right along to public comment. I do have one request. Anybody else that wants to address? Yes.
President Estromera, if I might, we did receive one written set of comments too, and they are available on the back, at the back table for anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you, Joe. And so now is the time for any members of the public to address us on any issue not on the agenda. So you're welcome to address us at this point. I do have one request. If any of you want to address us, please have our clerk, Claudia, get a card from her, fill it out. Thank you. We'll start right away. Mr. Seth Jane. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the board and staff. My name is Seth Jane, and I'm a former U.S. Army aviator. I proudly served my country for almost 10 years. I currently own Sierra Geotech, a disabled veteran business enterprise. We're a micro-small business based in the greater Sacramento area. Last month from this very location, I was thankful to have the opportunity to address the board about the importance of making DVBE participation mandatory in all future civil engineering professional service contracts. Since then, I'm happy to inform the board that several California-based disabled veteran business-owned engineering firms have approached us showing their support. I'm also happy to inform the board that 3 disabled veteran-owned firms are joining forces to submit a well-qualified proposal to a recently issued RFQ by the Delta Conveyance Authority. I hope the board sees this new development as a strong signal from the disabled veteran-owned businesses showing interest in providing civil engineering and associated professional services for the iconic Water Fix project. As the members of the board and staff know to date, many contracts have been awarded without mandatory DVBE participation. While this may be a discouraging statistic, I strongly believe that with your help, the future will be different. If the message around mandatory DVBE participation does not come from the board, our firm and many others like it do not stand a chance. Members of the board, as you embark on making disabled veteran-owned participation mandatory for engineering services, on behalf of the entire disabled veteran community, I would like to thank you in advance for the difference that you guys could make for us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Jane. As we mentioned before, we will be adopting a policy in the near future that will incorporate your requests. I have no further requests to address us, so we'll move right along. We don't have anything on the consent calendar this afternoon,
Minutes.
but we'll take up the approval of the minutes.
Motion to approve last meeting's minutes.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Motion is second to approve the minutes. Those for motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? There be no consent calendar. We'll move right along to discussion items. 9A, consider adopting conflicts of interest code. We've had the publication previously, I think for at least a month, or is it 2 now?
Thank you, Mr. President. So you're absolutely right. This is the final stage of this process. So under California, the Political Reform Act, all local agencies need to adopt a conflict of interest code. That conflict of interest code requires certain employees and contractors to list their financial interests to promote transparency in that effort. The process for adopting a code is set forth in the law, and generally what it requires is that first the draft code be noticed and circulated for comment. At the end of that process, along with those comments, it's then brought back before you for your consideration and approval. We have done the notification and publication process. No comments have been received, and it's ready before you for adoption. If the board decides to move forward with adopting it this afternoon, the next step in the process is submitting the code to the Fair Political Practices Commission for their review and approval. At that point, the folks that are identified in the code will be filing their Form 700s as required. The one tweak on this is, as many of your member agencies generally file your codes with your county board of supervisors, the reason we're filing with the FPPC is we're obviously a multi-county agency. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions?
So is there any changes since the last time we considered this?
There's not.
Thank you.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and second for approval. Those for motion say aye.
Aye. Just
Oh,
have
I'm
one
sorry.
comment. Sorry
I'm
about
sorry,
that.
Doug.
There is misspelling in the title and in the resolution. I thought we should.
Let's fix it. With that correction, motion is second. Those for motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? Passes unanimously. We'll move right along to item B. Consider passing resolution authorizing a professional services agreement to provide engineering design management services.
President Estramera, I'm pleased to introduce our interim chief engineer, Sergio Baez.
Good afternoon, Mr. Valles. How are you?
Thank you, President Estamera and directors. Let's see.
Any questions?
I'm going to discuss the engineering design manager. By way of background, the California Water Fix, we're designing and building a conveyance facility that includes two tunnels, 3 intakes, 2 forebays, large pumping plants, and a couple of canals. And going on to the background for the engineering design manager, we're looking at the next 2 phases. Phase 1 was actually done during the planning process and environmental documentation. We did enough to determine the maximum impacts based on the current design. Okay. Now we're moving into preliminary design and final design, and that's where we need the engineering design manager. And that also includes support during construction by them. But today's action is for just the phase 2. The engineering design manager will provide the DCA with assistance to help us organize, manage, and coordinate the activities of a number of consultants. These consultants include like the designers of the intakes, the forebays, the tunnels, the pumping plants, and so forth. And we want them to bring together the activities and make sure that they're all well coordinated and organized. And we also want them to do some specialized studies. For instance, system hydraulics study, so we know that the hydraulics are working from one end to the other. Also, physical modeling of the intakes, for instance, and some logistical studies. Those are just examples of the types of things that they'll be doing. We'll also have them assist us in the future phase for construction support. For instance, answering questions from the field, working with the construction manager, and reviewing submittals by contractors. And then lastly, we want them to do a lot of initial planning, so we make sure that all of the teams are very well coordinated and organized, and that includes dividing up the conveyance system into manageable parts. How many contracts are we going to issue? How many design contracts and construction contracts are going to be put forward? We went through a solicitation process. It started back in December of last year. We received four statement of qualifications. If the primes were SBEs or DVBs, they actually received 100 points. However, none of the respondents qualified for those 100 points, but they were deemed responsive. We had a panel of evaluators made up of 5 chief engineers and a deputy operations officer. Pretty qualified team. They used 5 criteria to evaluate the submittals. Some items such as the firm's qualifications and experience, the staff qualifications and experience, their general technical approach to working on the project and how they would manage the effort. Those are just a few of the things. We requested that the firms or the top ranking firm give us a best and final offer. There were some changes to the numbers. And the recommendation by the team is to award to the highest scoring team, which in this case was CH2M Hill. This lays out the budget and the overall schedule that will need the firm, the EDM, to work with us. For the first 5 years, we're planning on a $110 million budget. Then, as we award contracts, we'll come back to the board and request further funding. That would add another $40 million for a grand total of $150 million for that team. So the recommended action is to authorize the executive director to negotiate and execute a 5-year professional services agreement with CH2M Hill for phase 2 services. And the $110 million breaks down to $93 million for the contract, $17 million in contingency, because we're at the very early stages of this program. Any questions? Any questions?
Questions?
Yes,
Yes.
will CH2M Hill be, will they be able to bid on the design contracts that will go under this, or are they precluded from doing that?
They are precluded. We want them as managers.
Any further questions? Entertain motion? Second?
Second.
Okay, those for the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? Passes unanimously. We'll move right along then to presentations on the types of alternative delivery methods, financing, and case studies.
So we have two presentations, one from a financial team comprised of Sperry Capital, KPMG, and Infra Associates, and we'll start with that.
Thank you.
If I could ask the board members, if you could hold your questions to the end of the presentation, then we'll answer questions about the first presentation. Then we'll do the second presentation and answer questions about the
Okay.
second.
That's good. Will do.
Good afternoon, board and members of the audience. My name is Jim Gibbs. I'm a principal with Sperry Capital. Our firm is a longstanding advisor to public agencies for infrastructure financing. And as a part of a team with KPMG and Infra Associates, we also engage in strategic advisory work for public agencies on alternative delivery methods for big projects such as water fix. I'm joined here today by my colleague from Sperry, Garth Salisbury, and by the owner of Infra Associates, Chris Margaronis. A very important member of our team, of course, is KPMG, represented by Gareth Lee. He was unable to join us, so we're going to carry the ball without him. So our objective here today, as in the first presentation, is to give you really an overview, a broad overview of the application of alternative delivery methods to the water fix project. I want to point out we're fully aware that your ability to use any of these alternatives is actually not permitted by state law at this time. So bear in mind, if the reasoning carries that you should do this, you'll be going to the state legislature. The positive side is that there is a long history, primarily outside of the U.S., but now a lot here, of the use of these methods in big infrastructure projects, and the track record is actually quite good. It's very good. And we'll cite a study that has the statistics to back that up. I want to also point out that in the role that we perform as strategic advisors, we don't advocate the use of alternative delivery methods. We advise you on your decision as to whether to do so or not. That's a role we've played many times. So, you know, we are here to throw out the idea that you may want to do this, and if so, you should have an advisor, such as our team, working through the decision on each of the component elements of the water fix project as to whether one of these methods would be appropriate or not, and we have a method for doing that. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Margaronis, to start through the process here.
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Margaronis. One of my earlier jobs in my career was for LA Metro out of their alternative delivery group, so this is very relevant. Just to quickly go through, that was already done for me more or less by the design engineer, but some highlights. Look, you know, this is a large-scale, complicated project with multiple contracts. Contract management is indeed a complex job. There are other large-scale projects in California there are some opportunities for understanding and also some points that we want to make about alternative delivery. So cost and schedule control is one of them. Transfer of responsibility. Allocation of risk is really one that I want to hone in on, and really finding the appropriate entity to manage that risk. That is a large-scale opportunity in large-scale infrastructure projects. Deciding who is in control of a given risk and the appropriate entity to hold on to it. This is an issue in many large-scale public infrastructure projects, and a key component of alternative delivery. The other thing that I'll hone in on here is the ability to consider operational and life cycle costs. We think of the cost to build a project, but the actual operations and maintenance after the project's already built runs a pretty hefty bill too. And so by aligning interests with the entity that is doing the building or the designing, having them take on the operations and maintenance responsibility also forces them to make decisions and can provide efficiencies. Moving on to the next slide, key characteristics beyond design, bid, build. So the first point there, so alternative delivery may include two or more of the components listed up there. There are a number of different ways that this is done, and Garth will highlight some of them in a couple slides. The idea is that you're sharing risk. Who is the entity responsible for this? Who's the entity responsible for that? There's opportunity for financing that isn't accessible to public sector or public entities on their own. Competitive bidding processes and long-term contracts. You can fix certain pieces of the contract so that you know what your cost is all the way through the entire life cycle of the project. And a point to make about what alternative delivery is not. It is not a transference of ownership of public sector assets to a private entity. Frequently there's a lease term. The term depends on sort of the appetite, but it is not a transference. And also, it is not a loss of control. Ultimately, the public entity is the decision maker. They create the contract that the private entity is required by law to abide by. So those are some distinctions. And on this next slide, I will pivot to Garth from Sperry Capital.
Thanks, Chris. So on this next slide, we're looking at effectively the continuum of private delivery options. And again, as Chris said, we're talking about private delivery here and delivery options. And on the one end, it can be just design build, and then out to, and when we use this term interchangeably in some respects, is to a pure public-private partnership or P3. So you'll hear those terms used interchangeably here. And so on your left is really the design, bid, build. What's probably most likely, were you not to consider other options, what would happen here with WaterFix? And as you go from left to right, you have more transfer of risk, more transfer of operational control, and then also and financing through these different options. And there's many different combinations of design, bid, build, finance, design, bid, build, operate, and maintain in this spectrum. So, but again, as Chris mentioned and Jim as well, really what we're focused on here is risk allocation and transfer of those risks and the appropriate transfer of risks, in addition to efficiencies that can be gained through bringing in the private sector for certain aspects of the project. The different types of contracts and contractual structures vary from pure public sector to the private sector, again, across the spectrum. And I also do want to point out that, so when you look from left to right, some of, this is a pretty complex slide, but vertically it's not always in alignment with each option. So, for example, in a design, build, operate, and maintain, you would have management, you could have management contracts and so on, and you might have an availability payment below, but again, you wouldn't have user fees being collected by the private sector. So payment mechanisms, again, the full range of possibilities. In a design-build situation, you'd have a milestone payment. If the private entity was going to operate and maintain the facility over its life, you'd have an availability payment that we'd be making these payments continuously throughout the life of that contract. And then possibly shadow fees, and then where the private sector is really doing just about everything in the project, they would also might be collecting user fees, like in the case of a toll road, for example. And finance, let's talk about this a little bit, because this is one of the big things that particularly we hear from the public sector is that, well, we have access to, we have AAA issuers who are going to be issuing tax-exempt debt. This is clearly, and is indeed clearly the cheapest cost of financing a project like this. But there's also the possibility with an alternative delivery option that there could be private activity bonds utilized, which again are tax exempt. So you'd still be able to have some advantage of tax exemption. There's, as you know, you've applied for WIFIA financing, extremely advantageous and very, very cost effective. And then going out the spectrum, obviously the private sector might be using, we don't mention here, but just taxable debt, but very often it's bank debt, and then private equity. There's a tremendous amount of private equity chasing infrastructure projects in the U.S. Now, it is more expensive, but again, the cost is not as nearly as expensive as you might imagine, given the amount of demand for the ability to invest in something like WaterFix. Oh, that's me. I've got the control here, don't I? There it is. Okay. All right. So common concerns. So it's often raised by agencies and stakeholders prior to considering this. And again, in a publicly sponsored project like WaterFix. So this, I want to make sure we're clear about this. This is not a private project that is then is developed privately and then is made available to the public through user fees or an offtake contract. Again, this is a public project where you're considering alternative methods for delivering aspects of the project, including partially financing. So again, on the perception and reality that P3 is privatization. In reality, as you said, the public sector will own this project and will define the project requirements and will retain, again, ownership and control. A common perception is, well, P3 costs more. As we talked a little bit about the financing aspect, and that's true between tax-exempt debt and a weighted cost of capital between taxable debt and equity. But oftentimes these P3s, when you look at the overall cost of the project over its life, when you take into account the whole life costs and maintenance, it's actually a lot cheaper than, the whole notion of just completely being financed with tax-exempt debt. There's a tremendous amount of competitive tension that reduce costs. And again, some of these schedule and cost savings up front, capital costs, can more than offset some of the higher cost of capital. Another common misperception is that P3s lead to job losses. Well, any infrastructure project that gets built, is going to produce jobs and revenue. So new infrastructure helps stimulate economic growth in that area. And project labor agreements can dictate local hiring. So you will have control over the workforce that's involved in the project for every aspect that you might consider for alternative delivery. Quality of the service will decline in the P3 model. Well, the payment mechanisms we talked about, availability payments and otherwise, will regulate the performance. And penalties can accrue and actually lead to actually defaults and withholding some of those availability payments. So you will have control over the ongoing oversight of the project. Let me talk again. So the public sector loses control. Well, you will maintain direct oversight through a contract management role and regular reporting requirements on the part of the private sector. Another concern often stated is that private investors can earn excessive profits. In fact, revenue and profit sharing requirements upside that's available to the private sector. So evaluating the benefits, I think Jim mentioned, and before you would undertake any type of alternative delivery, you would need to do a very detailed risk and cost analysis. And this is generally known as a value for money analysis. Now this is somewhat of a dumbed down graphic, but effectively you look at doing this from the public sector side, we really want to focus on, versus on the right, a private sector alternative is the risk retention. So as we said, you would expect to be able to lay off a lot of the risks to the private sector developer. O&M, we certainly believe, and has been shown that over time, if the private sector is managing the O&M over time, that there can be some savings there. Financing costs we talked about. Yes, in fact, private sector, very likely the financing costs would be larger or greater. And then construction costs with efficiencies, bidding, and overall timing of delivery. You should be able to save money on construction costs. So net, you have this value for money analysis. Now, it doesn't always prove that an alternative delivery is going to be better. But this is the kind of analysis you would undertake to show whether it made sense and that there was value for money to go with an alternative delivery. So, next steps. So alternative delivery options can produce better outcomes when compared to traditional design bid build. As we mentioned, alternative delivery options would require some legislation. So if you're considering this as you move forward, that'd be, again, yet another item on your to-do list to get the legislation to allow you to pursue these other options. Alternative delivery options require a thorough and detailed preparation of project agreements on the front end to ensure all the appropriate risk transfer, performance requirements, and project controls. We would need to engage a strategic advisory team to assist the authority in strategic assessment to determine the optimum delivery method for each specific element of the project, if any. In conducting a strategic assessment and subsequent business case, supporting risk and financial analysis will provide the basis for the agency to make the decisions if public alternative delivery makes sense.
So these methods have been successfully used in tunneling projects, in large tunneling projects. We have on this page, there are 3 projects, all in the U.S., 2 of them in Los Angeles. On the following page is a large project, the Port of Miami Tunnel. Of even larger scale, those are all transportation projects. On an even larger scale and getting into water and wastewater, in England, there are 2 even bigger ones. What's called the Thames Tideway is a 15-mile, large diameter conveyance line to basically carry wastewater from metropolitan London down to a regional treatment plant closer to the English Channel. It is about a $4 billion project, and it's just getting underway. And it is under a contract and a partnership agreement that covers design, build, finance, long-term operation, and maintenance. Even larger is a subway tunnel called the London Crossrail. It's even closer in scale to Waterfix. It's a 73-mile line with 13 miles of tunnel. And rather than tunneling through the sediments of the delta, they tunneled right underneath central London, which was pretty complicated. It was very successful, and it was done under a whole array of design-build contracts. We do want to point out that there are counterexamples. You may have heard of the Big Dig in Boston. It's not very long, but it's a big tunnel that went way late and way over budget. It was done with a traditional design bid build approach. In Seattle, there is a tunnel that has run into trouble because the tunnel boring machine ran into a large steel pipe and got stuck. And they're bickering. In Ottawa, they did another transportation tunnel and hit a sinkhole. So all these examples, actually, the one thing they have in common is they all highlight the geotechnical risks of doing tunneling on a large scale, and the question of who is going to cover that risk in the performance of the project is a very important question. Lastly, in 2007, in Australia, where they've used these methods very extensively for a long time, they did a study of 21 alternative deliveries and 31, I think I got the number right, traditional design bid build projects. It was a good large sample. They found that statistically there was a very clear advantage to these alternative delivery methods when you take into account the time period from the decision to proceed to the completion. The average advantage in cost was 30%. In other time periods, other positive results were noted. So this completes what we wanted to tell you today. Happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Steve?
So can you explain to me the difference between design, build, and expound on maybe some of the other variations of it? Is P3 technically a design build, or is it a variation?
Design build follows under this large umbrella of public-private partnerships. It represents an assignment of design responsibility and construction responsibility to a consortium, a team of both engineering and construction firms. And they basically take more of the risk associated with design and construction than is the case with the public sponsor when a design bid build process is used. Now, we've mentioned that there are a bunch of other facets that can be incorporated in a P3, including financing, including long-term operation, including maintenance, including sort of virtual ownership role through contracts where you actually directly receive revenue from a toll road, for instance.
And so if we were to consider alternative delivery methods, where should we start? Should we start with an assessment of risk, or do other things have to happen first?
The first thing is to have a pretty clear sense of what the components of the project are going to be, so you can isolate, different elements to analyze with regard to delivery. I mean, we would certainly expect that the three diversion structures could be individually analyzed, perhaps reaches of the tunnel, canals, pumping plants, so forth. So you need to have that definition in order to focus your analysis. And the second step in the process is to, with good engineering, experienced engineering advice, to compose a scenario for doing the project on a design bid build basis and identifying, the scale of risk in that approach, and then also describing the scenario of transferring risk and design and construction responsibility to a design-build team. And with those quantified as much as possible, we can then run this value for money analysis and tell you how it looks. We don't do this, in a darkened room. It's a very collaborative process.
Okay, well, I like collaboration. One more question. You've given us some good examples of some successful projects and then also some maybe not so successful projects.
Right.
Is this particular project, in your opinion, a candidate for us even considering alternative methods?
We think it is a good candidate. This big analysis done in Australia highlighted the fact that big complex projects under these sort of different disciplines do well the bigger the project is and the more complicated it is. It's all in their analysis. If you're comparing these specific tunneling examples, the water fix is certainly very large. It's very long. Tunneling will take years. But it may very well be that the geology that you're dealing with, which is, the sediments of the delta, may have less geotechnical risk. And we know that you'll be drilling to test the geology. But it looks like it's worth a really careful look.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a second?
We do. We have John Bischoff from AECom, who's going to give us a shorter version than what he gave to Sites Reservoir Project.
Good afternoon. I'm John Bischoff. I'm with AECom, and my background has been in the design and construction of tunnels and heavy geocivil structures like dams for the last at least 40 years. So I'm really happy to be here today. This is an interesting project, and there's some major decisions that are going to have to be made as discussed in the earlier presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these alternative delivery methods today. And when we talk about alternative delivery, what do we mean? Well, alternative delivery means alternative ways to contract for both for the design and for the construction to deliver a project. And for public works project, most of the time in the past, the conventional design bid build method has been used to complete the project, and where the owner hires a designer, the designer prepares the plans and specifications, and then once it goes out to bid, and then the successful bidder constructs the project. So that's traditionally been used, but other methods have been gaining popularity and greater use around the world, actually, major projects. So when we talk about alternative delivery, there are a number of considerations to be taken into account in deciding what to do. And the objectives of the project are universal for all projects, but they have to be considered. The project has to be done economically, viable, and efficient. It has to be completed on or below budget if possible. It's got to be environmentally acceptable, sustainable, and widely accepted by the public. And so the objectives that for a project have to be considered both from the the owner's side, and the contractor's side. But those objectives can sometimes be quite different. From the owner's perspective, the owner is looking to optimize cost, get value for his dollar, maximize the quality, complete the project on schedule or earlier if possible. If there are changes during the construction, it's got to be flexible to change He wants to delegate as much risk as possible to the contractor within reason, and he wants to have control over the design of the project. So that's what the owner wants. Contractor, on the other hand, wants to maximize his profits or at least minimize his losses on a project. And he wants to maximize his workforce efficiency, meet schedule, time is money, he's got to get it done. He wants to get paid for what he does do, and he wants to minimize his risk. So there are a number of things, and these are sometimes not in line with one another. So there are a number of alternative delivery methods that are out there, and this list is not comprehensive by any means. But the traditional ones, as you can see, design, bid, build, which I mentioned, traditional design build, I'm going to go through some of these, progressive design build, construction management at risk, the Portland method, which is was used on a tunnel up in Portland, and that's what we've been calling it, project alliance, and there are other methods as well. And, you know, each of these methods could be used individually or combined on a major feature project such as you have with the water fix. So you're not stuck with just one method for the whole project. So that should be considered. So I'm going to talk about some of these methods, but before I do, I just want to talk a little bit about risk on a project. There are many risks that have to be dealt with on projects, and these are extremely important, must be considered both in the design and the construction. Such things as site access, logistics, the potential for unanticipated adverse subsurface conditions, inclement weather, escalation factors, the cost of oil or equipment or cement. All these things can impact a project and impact it adversely. So they represent risks that must be considered both by the owner and the engineer as well as the contractor. So when we talk about risk, well, who owns the risk? And this is what I call a risk spectrum. And you can see the various delivery methods along the bottom, where we have traditional design build, which I'll talk about in a moment, on the left side, and design bid build on the right side. So for a given project, the base cost of a project is the cost. But on top of that, there are contingencies that have to be carried on the project. And either the owner carries the contingency or the contractor carries the contingency, or they both carry the contingency. So depending upon the risk that's present that is delegated to the contractor, that contingency is going to go up. And those costs may or may not ultimately be needed to be spent, but for design build, it'll show up early in the contractor's bid. So given the time that I do have, I'm going to just talk about the first three methods very quickly. So looking at design, bid, build, again, that's on the right side of the risk spectrum. It's a well-established method. It's a most widely used method still today. It's used universally. It's proven. It has strong contractual basis. But sometimes because of the way the risks are handled or the way the contract documents are laid out, the owner and contractor's interests are not always aligned. And sometimes they can end up with an adversarial situation. And particularly when you have a major underground project, such as you have with potential for change conditions, et cetera, those interests can vary quite heavily as the project moves on. So looking at the main risks with design, bid, build, the risk is if there's incomplete investigations and change conditions or differing site conditions appear during construction, that can convert into a claim. If the risks aren't properly allocated, that can also translate into time extensions and claims. If, for higher risk projects, the engineer may build contingency in the design, and the contractor may stack up contingencies in his bid. So you have contingencies on top of contingencies, and that is a problem. So key steps in managing and mitigating risks with design bid build: you have to have comprehensive site investigations. You know, there's a rule of thumb of about 1% of construction minimum going into underground construction for tunnel construction. So that level of investigation is important. The design details have to be robust and constructible and well thought out, considering the risks that I mentioned before. There has to be a clear allocation of risks between the owner and the contractor. Who's covering, who's responsible for some of these risks? And the cost of those risks have to be fairly allocated. So now I'm going to switch to design build, and what I call traditional design build. And again, on the risk spectrum, that's on the other side of the spectrum plot. So with design build, the owner and the designer and the contractor are on the same team, and it's led by the contractor typically. The risk is almost completely allocated to the contractor designer, and the owner, because of the very nature of it, once that contract has been let, the owner does not have a lot of influence on the design. He has to allow the contractor to design and build that project and get it done. It works best where the risks are well defined and where the schedule is limited. And as mentioned earlier, schedule is very beneficial with the design build. But depending upon the outcome of the project, if the project doesn't look the way the owner planned it to be when the job is done, then there can be some disappointment with design build. So that has to be very carefully thought through. With the bid phase, during the bid phase, typically 3 designer-contractor teams are shortlisted. Design concept may not be fully developed at the time of the bid. So, and similarly, the environmental permitting process may be ongoing at the same time. So that means regulatory agencies may have some things that show up later on in the game after the bid is placed, and that can be a problem depending upon compliance issues. Again, those translate eventually into contingencies. There is limited geotechnical baseline information available, and this is again at the time of the bid phase, and limited time for design and bidding. During the design phase, this is after the design build contractor has been selected. Design is typically pretty fast track. It moves fast, it has to. There are risks of data gaps because of timing. The contractor only had so much information at the time of bid. He'd be doing more investigations, but all that needs to be planned, and you know, there's a fair amount of work to do in a limited amount of time. Similarly, on the design concept, there's not as much time to improve on the design concept that was put in on the bid. So innovation can be impacted to a certain extent, and contractors like to have, particularly for tunnel projects, they have their own equipment, means and methods and that type of thing, and they want to take advantage of those innovations, but it may or may not they may or may not be able to do that. During the construction phase, just depending upon the amount of investigations, there are potentials for change conditions. It can happen. And if the designer is actively involved with the contractor during construction, which is the best case scenario, then he can help the contractor look for things that could arise during construction and help him stay out of trouble to a certain extent. Contractor must be allowed to build the project without interference from the owner. if the owner gets in the way, it represents slowing down the process, and that can be a problem. So the owner, to the extent practicable, has to stay out of the contractor's way. This is a typical schedule for comparing design bid build with design build. As you can see, in the early stages, the concept design, preliminary design, those are fairly consistent with one another. But with the design build, you select the design builder, complete final design, but you can start construction on different phases of the work earlier. And what that means, procurement, equipment can be procured, or there may be different pieces of the project that can get started early without having to complete the full design as you would with a standard design bid build type package. And the time savings can range anywhere from 10 to 30%. And that, for a long project, many billion-dollar project, that's significant. Just the time value of money, it could be significant. So that is a consideration that you would take into account as you're looking at the project options. So the progressive design build is the next one. Oops. Sorry. So additional benefits of design build: single entity responsible for the design construction. There's earlier cost certainty with the project. Efficient administration. The contractors handling and the design team are handling it almost everything. So there's fewer potential for disputes during construction. Not saying that there won't be disputes, but there are fewer, put it that way. So now, the next one is progressive design build. And that shows right here on the risk, where it's more of a shared risk approach. So the work is performed in a two-phased approach. Step one is 30% design and development of a guaranteed maximum price, which is the GMP. And step two is final design and construction. So in selecting a design build team using the progressive design build approach, it's a qualifications-based selection of 3 to 5 designer contractor teams, typically 3. They shortlist the firms. The shortlisted firms submit proposals to do step one, which is a 30% design and development of the guaranteed maximum price. And then they select the team. Now, in putting together the proposal for step one, that's to complete the 30% design and guaranteed maximum price development. Shortlisted teams, design build teams receive the RFP. They put together a proposal which documents fully their approach, their technical approach, their permitting process approach. They identify additional studies, geotechnical work that needs to be done, and they identify public outreach requirements in their proposal. And then they develop that 30% design. So during step one, the team develops a 30% design, guaranteed maximum price and schedule, in full collaboration with the owner. So the owner is directly involved. And oftentimes the owner pays the shortlisted team, and usually pays for that development of that 30% design. So the owner has much greater involvement. In phase two, the design is developed for construction. Public outreach program is implemented. All the agency, environmental, and construction permits are obtained, and the designer assists in managing the risks during construction. So everything is open book. So the owner knows what he's paying and where the money's going to. There's a fair amount of administration required there, but at least he has control of where the money's going and where it may be heading So that's important. So in summary, for progressive design build, the owner has full participation throughout the two-step design and construction process. The owner can modify the work depending upon his needs in terms of the design and how it looks. There's a reduced opportunity for contractor claims because they've worked together, they put together the maximum price, and including contingencies. They both understand where the money is, and the contingency money isn't spent unless it's needed. So that's the idea. Project delivery schedule can be reduced, and typically the design-build contingency is less than traditional design-build delivery process. So in summary, overall, there are a variety of project delivery methods. The selected methods have to be tailored specifically to the project that is being constructed. And if you have a multi-feature project, as I mentioned earlier, you can use one method for this feature and another method for another feature, as long as the contracts are well coordinated with one another. So the most appropriate project delivery method would depend on the size, complexity, and the inherent risks, many of which I've mentioned before. The risks need to be managed fairly and allocated properly, and they have to best align with both the owner and the contractor's objectives. So that's it. Any questions?
Questions?
So why is it that you skipped the CMAR method?
Because I had 11 and a half minutes to make this 8-hour presentation.
Fair enough.
Any further questions? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well done, well done. You were able to use them all. Okay, we'll move right along to the Executive Director's report.
It's in your packets. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. We did include a couple attachments this time, one of which is the interagency agreement staffing recruitment process that we've tentatively worked out. Another is the contracts issued today. I wanted to start reporting on the contracts that you've authorized staff to execute, and just to let you know whether they've actually been executed yet. So this is a to-date report, but going forward, we'll probably be reporting this is what happened in October or November or whatever the previous month is. I don't expect the entire list all the time. I just wanted to start giving you updates. And then several people have asked me about the procurement schedule. We put one in, and I see it's already changed a little. We're trying to get these out as quickly as we can. Sometimes we change the scope a little as we're brainstorming with our transition staff. So for instance, the environmental procurement has not yet gone out, even though we say November. I don't expect it will go out in the next 2 weeks because we're still hammering out some details of exactly how we want the scope to read. The power is already out on the streets, though, so that was a little ahead of schedule. The environmental's a little behind. We'll make it all work, but this gives you an idea of about when things are going out. The program manager RFQ did get extended for another week, so it's not due till next week now. But any other questions you might have, I'm happy to try and field.
The office is coming along.
The office is coming along. I'm hoping to bring a recommendation to you in December. As we've heard, once we can co-locate everybody in a single place, I think it'll help that whole
Absolutely.
DCA team start gelling more quickly.
Great. Questions? Thank you, Jim. We've got Stephanie's report and council report. Josh is here.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Stephanie's report's in your packet, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Josh? Okay, we'll move right along over to Julie's report on Treasurer's monthly report for October?
Well, thank you, President Estromera. Again, my report is in your package, my written report, and I have no additions to it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, June. Any? Thank you, June. Appreciate the fact that it's a plus. It's to the plus territory.
You know, if I might mention one thing, we've been working, as you all know, very closely with DWR's Design Construction Office, the DCO for short. And we did get an electronic wire that we received on Wednesday, so.
Yes, we did, for our first invoice.
Yay, our first invoice is paid in full.
We exist,
Yay.
right?
Mr. Mayor, comment?
Yes, Steve.
June, I'm pleased to see that we have nothing in the 31 to 60 day and beyond aging, so that's good.
That
That's
is
a
good.
work.
We're trying to
Yeah.
process everything timely.
Keep it on a clip. All right. Future agenda items? Any requests up here? Anything to report? Okay. Would you just quickly report just a few minutes on our executive search? Just to keep people up on what we're up to.
The executive recruitment is proceeding. The recruiter is working with the board on next steps.
Thank you. But it's moving along, that's important, okay. We're done with future agenda items then? Okay, then it's time to adjourn. Thank you all for attending the meeting.